In 1985, the USSR was in decline, but there was no sign that it was going to collapse. You will see a number of different interpretations which suggest a number of different factors or combination of factors. Some highlight problems set by earlier leaders, others focus upon the importance of Gorbachev and his mistakes and miscalculations. Some historians and academics stress the impact of and actions of Yeltsin and the treatment of nationalists by the USSR and the weaknesses that this exposed in the system. These factors all contribute to the downfall of the USSR, and it's important to use the consequences of these actions and events to see how significant each of these factors actually is in the downfall of the USSR to add weight to these arguments. Firstly, the command economy as set up by Stalin actually superficially worked in the short term, but as a long-term policy it actually hindered development in the USSR. The Cold War meant that focus upon arms was massively expensive, and decline starts during the reign of Khrushchev and continues with the stagnation of the Brezhnev era. The economy is highly centralised and controlled by the Communist Party. This lack of nurturing of ideas and people created a workforce which had little incentive to innovate and create a dynamic economy. Often goods are created for no reason. Tractors are a prime example of this, where 400,000 are produced per year in the 1980s, but 20% are never actually used due to a shortage of tractor drivers. These centralised government departments are responsible for providing a timetable for planning, harvesting and sending the right equipment and supplies to farms at the correct times. However, they're not agricultural experts, and these did not happen at the right times and did not maximise and create efficient production within the USSR. Former leaders had actually directed funds towards the republics to ensure that people in these areas remain compliant. Their living standards were higher than those in Russia, and their education is better funded. Now, Gorbachev attempts to reverse and address the decline in three ways. These measures were designed to modernise the economy, but in fact caused the economy to shrink. Firstly, he tried to stimulate economic growth with Ukraina in 1985 to 86. This translates as acceleration, which requires a good deal of funding. His attempts to help improve the workforce by tackling the issue of alcoholism were clearly an issue that damaged his economy. He limited alcohol production. This drove the production underground, and some capitalised on the state reducing their production by 50% and supplied the market with Samagen, which was illegally manufactured alcohol. Whilst this seems a noble effort on Gorbachev's part, it undermines the economy, as the tax worth 67 billion rubles could have been gained at this point and could have been used to support his economic policies. A dip in the price of oil, which had become the USSR's main source of income from exporting to the West, meant a shortfall in their tax, which once again could have been used to support his economic policies. Gorbachev's mistake here was ignoring his economic experts alongside having to fund acceleration with Western funds. So any profits from modernisation went to loans and interest repayments and not back into the Soviet economy. This meant there was less money to modernise or produce consumer goods and improve the standards of the Soviet people. Therefore, this impacts upon apathy felt towards the Communist Party, which undermines his efforts in other ways. As this failed, Gorbachev introduced market forces. Allowing private trade and subsidising the production of these for the people meant that the government got into further debt and also served once again to undermine communism. As the turnover of these private companies, known as cooperatives, went from 29.3 million rubles to 1.04 billion rubles, capitalism clearly seemed to be working over communism. Subsidising goods, as the government did, was not a long-term strategy, and by 1990 Gorbachev had to stop it in order to stop the government spending. Once again, this helped to lose faith in the capabilities of the Communist Party, and Gorbachev, whose approval rating then dropped from 52% to 21%. This caused public unrest, and strikes increased, highlighting the disbelief in the communist system to be able to resolve these problems. It was made worse by severe food shortages in 1990. So putting it simply, hungry people are unhappy people. Finally, between March 1990 and August 1991, the command economy is abandoned and a full market economy is introduced. This caused factions within his own party to divide up and publicly work in different directions. He tried to hide the capitalist nature by putting words socialist in front of his policies, such as socialist markets. But this is not enough to unite the Communist Party and prevent hardliners from being highly critical. Gorbachev had to work politically to undermine the party. This weakened the party and weakened the role the party and plays into the overall downfall of the party. The big question is whether this situation was created by Gorbachev or whether his actions were a catalyst for the downfall of the USSR, activating the longer-term problems caused by years of poor economic problems. Gorbachev can be seen as an ideologue. He works publicly to suggest that he is actually working for an all-round improvement to socialism, to include genuine democracy, enabling people to exercise power, which was originally intended in his arguments by Marx and Lenin. This clearly creates a divide between the old guard in his party, who are career communists, and their exploitation of their positions to increase their own personal wealth, creating an elite damage the image of the party publicly. Gorbachev seems really here to have had good intentions, but similar to economic reforms, it could be suggested that this would promise much and achieve little. He introduces glasnost, which we know translates as openness. He freed up the censorship of the press and actively supported the liberalisation of the press and the arts to ensure that hardliners in the party were publicly criticised. The population are able to access foreign press and draw comparisons between their situations and those in capitalist nations. This undermined the Communist Party in the eyes of the people and helped in the long run to lose faith in the party. The massive poverty, inadequacies in healthcare and education are very different to the propaganda projected by the party, and openness and criticism did not hold the party to account. Actually, it weakened its power. This is clearly a political strategy by Gorbachev, as he wanted to introduce elections in 1989 and wanted the people to vote out the old guard / communist hardliners, who are clearly his opposition for reform, and replace them with young, more radical communists. The issue with this is that for radicals, Gorbachev isn't radical enough, and in the long run it set up a group who would challenge his personal power. So elections not only allowed a variety of communist candidates to run, but also independents. So again, this is supporting the idea of democracy and power back to the people. Here, though, it's clear that Gorbachev misread the mood of the people and the impact of glasnost and what it would have on the support of the party. Candidates had to engage in public debates rather than force the support the forced support they had in previous years, and it's clear the faith of the people was not with the Communist Party. Independents were able to heavily win elections in some areas and put up clear counters to the Soviet system. It went further to destroy the authority of the party, not something Gorbachev had originally intended, and he was clearly trying at this point to consolidate his leadership within the party and get a supportive party for his reforms. This specifically undermines him. He's an unelected leader, but the public have elected people such as Yeltsin, a prior member of the Communist Party, who'd been kicked out for his criticism of the party, to leadership roles in Russia. He clearly has a mandate, the support of the people, so his arguments are made much stronger than Gorbachev, who is able to set himself up as the clear and credible opponent to Gorbachev, with little that Gorbachev can actually do about it. Anything Gorbachev could try to do to undermine Yeltsin would make him look like a hypocrite, as he's supposedly democratising the USSR. Gorbachev did make some political moves. He created the role of president of the USSR in March 1990, but instead of holding an election, because he feared he'd lose it to Yeltsin, he made sure it was appointed by the Congress of People's Deputies, where he had a majority of support. Clearly, he was being highly hypocritical here. He used emergency powers that he gained with the role to restore order in the republics who are trying to get their freedom from the USSR. At this point, it's important to consider Gorbachev and how important his role was in undermining the USSR. Whether he was the poor politician that didn't understand the possible impacts of his actions and mistakenly undermined the USSR, causing its downfall, or whether he was trying to do what many other communist leaders had done in the past, increasing their own personal power base. Nevertheless, despite this idea of whether he intended to do it or not, he provided opponents of the regime with a platform to present alternative ideas to a general public who are apathetic towards an outdated system. The Union was made up of a number of different republics, and as previously mentioned, former leaders had kept them in the Union with incentives that Gorbachev was no longer able to provide due to economic problems and the openness provided by glasnost. Nationalist groups stood in Gorbachev's elections, and in Moscow in 1990, the Democratic Russia group won 85% of the seats. Gorbachev was under the misguided opinion that within the republics there was a Soviet people. However, former leaders had allowed local people to run the republics, whilst using the secret police and military to control these areas. Republics saw Russia as acting in an imperial way, and Russians having superiority, when Gorbachev replaced the previously nationalist leaders with his Russian leaders. especially as in order to ensure he had support for his political reforms, Russians are dominating these governments now. He did nothing to stop them exploiting their elitist positions in this area, whilst, due to the loss of economic support, people's living standards were decreasing. So there seems to be a clear divide in the wealthy and the superiority of the Russian nation or the Russian Republic. There was only clearly superficial Soviet nationalism, but Gorbachev believed this was genuine. Previous leaders had done little to ensure that this was really the case. Brezhnev had allowed each republic to educate its people in their own language, allow culture and the arts to foster their cultural identity of the republics, to keep them on side. In contrast, Andropov and Gorbachev want effective government, and Gorbachev believed that Russians are the way to do this, so his political reforms in elections had clearly allowed platforms for nationalist ideas and for people to show their public support for this through elections. So he treats the Eastern Bloc differently to the Russian republics, and this makes him look very imperialistic. The party and the leadership had been held together in the past, but this would weaken their authority in the long run. He suggests the Sinatra Doctrine, not called that specifically by him, but that these areas should follow socialism in their own way, and one by one the countries got their own freedom. He set a precedent for how the republics then would act to gain their freedom, having looked at the Eastern Bloc. He seemed powerless to do anything against this. His political reforms had separated him from the party, which weakened his position to do anything. Massacres between different ethnic groups in Azerbaijan and Armenia and Tbilisi saw him lose the support of the military. And this is something we know that from the time of the Tsar, Russian leaders have relied upon, and when they've lost this, they've lost their power. It took away his means of imposing Soviet authority. Openness meant the republics were able to access information, which again could make them critical. Environmental groups used this as a public platform to criticise the USSR for poisoning their area with chemicals, and they made it very clear they were Soviet. So they poisoned areas such as Chernobyl, and this is a clear sign that the public image is damaged and there's a loss of faith in the party in these different republics. Yeltsin is able to capitalise on this and starts to create a Russian army rather than a Red Army, and instructs them not to act against Ukrainian miners protesting in Donetsk once he's won the Russian presidency. Gorbachev actually tried to resolve this with the 9+1 agreement to create a federation of independent states with a single president, but Yeltsin is able to use the economic impact of the Soviets and present the idea that they should put Russia first. Russia elected Yeltsin as president with 57% of the vote in comparison to 16% of the vote won by the communist candidate. This gives him a mandate in comparison to Gorbachev, who never actually fought and won an election. The importance that nationalist feelings and actions for independence have, which led to a clear breaking up of the USSR, need to be considered as to how far Gorbachev caused this with his wider reforms, or whether they actually were circumstances outside of his control, or perhaps that Yeltsin actually stirred these up in the long run. A clever politician, Boris Yeltsin clearly had ambition. He's in the Communist Party and is thrown out when criticising key people. He uses Gorbachev's weaknesses against him, seemingly working with him, but really biding his time until circumstance was right. In 1991, hardline communists tried to hold a coup to oust Gorbachev. They publicly announced his resignation on ill health grounds, whereas the reality was he'd actually just gone on holiday. These hardliners had the support of both the KGB and the military. So for Yeltsin, if they'd actually achieved control at this point, this could have proved a much harder opponent for him to defeat in the future. So he supported Gorbachev, and possibly because he thinks this is going to be easier to defeat later on, as his authority has already been greatly weakened. However, possibly because he does feel that this is the right thing to do. This helped his public image, and he becomes a defender of democracy. He created alliances with other republics and was integral in the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, known as CIS, which made Gorbachev the president of a union that no longer existed. Gorbachev resigns 4 days after CIS is created, and the USSR ceases to exist on the 31st of December 1991. Yeltsin is very clearly a clever politician that's able to capitalise on Gorbachev's mistakes and lead a popular platform against a party and then the USSR. So he turns his role as key opponent into leadership. His role is undeniable, and he provided a popular and clear and credible opponent to the communist regime that Gorbachev represented. Consider the significance then of these factors and make a decision about whether it was Gorbachev, Yeltsin, the people, or a combination of factors which lead to the downfall of the USSR. Areas that you will need to consider are: what made the people become more involved when they became apathetic and repressed? The importance of misreading the national mood by Gorbachev, the importance of precedents that he actually set, and the importance of key players such as Yeltsin and circumstance. You can then, once you've already made your decision, weigh up what historians say when you read them about these issues, and you can see whether you agree with them so that you can use this to formulate an answer as to whether they provide a strong interpretation for the downfall of the USSR.